Welcome to Garden Wise Adventures. My name is Malie and I live in Utah Zone 6/7. It's in the middle of December. Actually, tomorrow is Christmas Eve. We had a little bit of rain last night and I've actually been out checking the soil moisture around some of my plants. Now you're probably wondering, okay, this is winter. I know we've had snow here in Utah, just rained. Why am I checking the moisture around my plants? So I'm going to go over the plants that I've looked at, why I'm looking at them, and why I feel this is important. Even if you live in an area where the snowfall has just barely melted and it just rained the night before. So before we go look at the plants, let's look at what I have here. Now, as I said, it rained last night, and I actually have a rain gauge right here. So this is an official rain gauge. I've been using it to kind of track the moisture that we get, because sometimes it seems like even though we've had a lot of rain, it feels like we've had a lot of rain, the soil moisture around my plants hasn't been that great. And what I've noticed is even though sometimes it feels like it's rained a lot, we get very little rain. Let's show you how much we got last night. Now, this rain collection gauge can be used to test the moisture in snow, and it can also measure how much rain we've gotten. So we've got a funnel right here. When I'm collecting snowfall, I take the funnel off. And then we have a little meter right here. Let's get it straight here. So as you can see, we didn't even get 1/10 of an inch, even though everything looks really wet outside. 1/10 of an inch is not going to sink very deep into any soil, even if it's wet. This does not water plants. I prefer seeing 1/2 inch to 1 inch of water per week before I turn off any of my irrigation. Now this is winter, irrigation is not on, and as I said, the snowfall just melted a couple of days ago. So let's go look and see where it's dry and where it's not dry. Now the first thing I want to talk about is lawns. This lawn right here is on the east side, but it's wide open and it captures all the rain and snowfall. Matter of fact, right over here was the last place that the snowfall melted because it's actually on the north side of this hill. So the moisture level in my lawn is really good. Let's kind of pull up a little bit of it and see what it looks like. Now if you look at this, it's quite saturated and wet, and it's saturated and wet all the way down. Now, even if we don't get much rain, even if it's a dry winter, I don't worry about lawn too much, and I don't ever come out and water it, no matter how dry it is, because the lawn goes dormant over the winter and is not using much water at all. This is Kentucky bluegrass, and it will recover in the spring and summer. It may show a little bit of damage, some dry spots from the dry winter, but that will eventually recover. So I don't waste water on lawn during the winter, no matter how dry it is. But let's look at this area. This area over here is right next to the lawn. It's pretty open. We've got my jujube tree. We've got some service berries. And then we've got a gooseberry back here, and it's under an overhang. This is on the east side of the house. The storms come from the northwest. If you look out here, this area right here is quite wet. That's definitely adequate moisture for this little gooseberry. But if you look just behind the gooseberry over here, you can see I've been messing with the soil already over here. We've got the wet right here, but over here, if you dig into the soil, it's bone dry, just a few feet away. So this little gooseberry right here is right straddling the line between the wet and the dry, and that's on purpose. I wanted the gooseberry to be back far enough into my bed that it didn't creep out into the lawn when it gets big, but I also wanted it to be able to get watered by the natural rainfall over the winter. I know this area is dry back here. That's why you don't see any plants back here. I don't want to have to water it in the winter. So the front half of the gooseberry roots are in the moisture. The back half is in the dry. But because the front half is getting the moisture, this plant will be fine over the winter. Now, if it was a little drier, this is a newer plant, I would definitely come in and water it. The service berries and the jujube, they're old enough trees that I'm not going to worry about those too much. Now, trees that I do worry about are all of my evergreens. Now, we have plenty of moisture in the soil around these trees right now, so I'm not going to worry about them. They have plenty of water. If they were drier years, every 4 weeks, if we had no moisture and if it was warm and the soil was dry, I would come out with a hose and trickle it for 2 or 3 hours over each one. Or if I couldn't use a hose, I would use several 5-gallon buckets just to make sure they had some moisture. Now let's look at the garden beds on the south side of my property. This is my Vijaga garden bed with my brand new Vijaga cover, and I'll link a video that talks about this cover and how wonderful it is. But my garden beds are covered, so they are not getting any moisture at all. So let's look inside here. Now, to be fair, I just watered these. I will go through my covered garden beds every 2 to 4 weeks and check the soil moisture and then water them. Now, the plants are not growing as quickly. They don't need as much water, and since it's under cover, there's very little evaporation. But this is how wet it is when I've actually watered the soil. I also mulch them very heavily so they lose moisture at a slower rate. So covered garden beds do need to be watched, especially if you're growing food in them. Now, I also heavily mulch my uncovered garden beds. The ones that are not growing anything, I do not water over the winter. But if there's anything growing in them, I will test the soil moisture every 2 to 4 weeks unless it's really dry, and then I'll test them even sooner if I start seeing drought stress on the plants. But if you're growing plants in your garden beds over the winter, they do need to stay moist. This bed looks empty here. I have not watered it for quite a while, but let's see what's growing in here. It's not empty. These are shallots. The shallots are growing nicely in here over the winter. And we've got a lot of good moisture in this soil. Part of the reason it's holding the moisture so well is I have a good deep mulch over them, and they're completely open to any storm that comes through. And I water the covered beds on this side of my property the same way as I do the sheltered ones on the south side. So I just check them every 2 to 4 weeks, and if they're dry, I give them some water. Then we come to my rosemary. Now, my rosemary is another one that I pay close attention to. Now, this is a plant that comes from the Mediterranean. It's very, very drought tolerant. I very rarely water it in the summer, but I very carefully watch it in the winter. One thing that rosemary cannot tolerate is cold, dry soil. That's when they die. If the soil is cold and the temperature is way below freezing, like in the teens, and the soil is dry, that's when you'll get winter damage. If you can keep the soil moist around a rosemary in the colder climates, this rosemary has actually had temperatures like -10 degrees. There was one year we had -10 degrees, but it had snow cover over it, and it was absolutely fine. We regularly get temperatures in the single digits where I live here, and it absolutely does just fine. And this is a 15-year-old rosemary plant. And I will link a video up above that talks about why we actually did have some dieback last winter. I think part of it was old age, part of it was the way it was trimmed, and part of it was we had gone through a dry winter a couple of years previous. Now, this area over here is on the north side of my property. I never really even check the soil moisture over here because any storm that comes through, this area gets absolutely hit because the storms come from the northwest. That's the northwest. You can see the storm line coming through. We're getting a few flurries of snow. You can see the clouds moving past the mountains. We've got some snow on the mountains up there. But this area, because it's on the north, also freezes and it stays frozen for a lot longer. It very rarely gets sun over here in the winter. It gets sun in the summer, but not in the winter. So it actually holds moisture a lot longer than any other area in my property. Another area that I check are my potted plants. Now, I have not watered these for a very long time. They've been open to all of the storms. As I said, the snow has not melted until a couple of days ago. And it stayed really nice and wet in here. If you look at that, the soil is still wet. The strawberries are not wilting at all. They don't have any cold damage because we haven't gotten that cold. And they were actually producing strawberries for a while there. These plants are succulents, and we have the opposite problem with these. Sometimes they get too wet over the winter. If they start getting too wet, I'll just cover them to make sure they don't get any more moisture. But You can see the new growth in there. The top is winter killed like it usually does. This is the sedum. These are the hens and chicks. And I try to make sure these have really well-draining soil because I know that they will hold moisture over the winter. And they've lasted for a couple of years in these pots, even through the winter months. We've got a purple sage there, culinary sage, and it looks like it's doing well too. Now, if we do have long dry spells, I will check these and water them every once in a while, maybe once or twice a winter if we don't get rainfall. Now, I also do watch the plants out front. This is the west side. It's open to the south and the north, so it does capture all the rain that comes through here. The plants that I do watch really carefully are my pawpaws, especially the newly planted trees. Any newly planted trees, ones that are younger than 3 to 4 years old, I will water if we don't have appreciable rainfall. And that means if we haven't had rainfall for a month, I'll check the soil and see how dry it is, and then I'll water them. But these look, I can tell from here that the soil is still wet. As I said, the snow just barely melted, so they're going to be good to go. But just a few feet away, there were plants I did need to water, even though this is open to the rainfall. Right up here, underneath this globe blue spruce, and sheltered by my weeping cherry, we have some evergreen plants right here. These are plants that grow throughout the winter and bloom in February. These are hellebore or Lenten rose, and the ground around them was completely dry because it was sheltered from all the storms that came through. Now, even though the ground was completely dry, and it's completely dry under this globe blue spruce, I'm not going to water the globe blue spruce. I'm just going to water these plants. The reason I won't water the globe blue spruce is because its roots have reached out away from the drip line out into where the moist soil is. So even if the underside is dry, I'm not that worried about it. Just a few more feet away, here's some more hellebore that were not protected from the winter storms. We're actually getting new growth on these. These are healthier and larger, and these are puny and are looking like they're getting some winter damage because I did not pay attention like I should have to these. So I will be paying attention to these from now on and give them water when the soil is dry. The other plants I also watch are any of my evergreen perennials. Now, most of my other perennials I'm not too worried about, and I don't come out and water too often unless it's extremely dry and we've had absolutely no moisture for a couple of months. But the evergreen ones are still growing, photosynthesizing, and using water. So if we have a dry stretch, I will come out and put some water on my evergreen plants. These are germander. I've got some box honeysuckle. I've got my strawberries. So those plants, and then these are Rocky Mountain penstemons. I don't think I would water these as often as I would the germander and the box honeysuckle though. This is on my west side. It's the hottest side. It's also under an overhang. And we had some plants growing in here. Now, I'm not so worried about these plants. The only reason I'm leaving them is because they still have flowers on them. But up against the house there, underneath the overhang, was completely bone dry, just like it was on the east side. So if I have plants over here that I'm concerned about, I would absolutely need to be watering these. And I actually did water them because I really did not want the snapdragons to die yet, because we've got a little bit more warm weather. It's unseasonably warm, but we've got more warm weather. They're not going to die, and I think they'll continue to flower. Now, the last place I wanted to show you is on the south side of my property. So if you look out here, next to the corner of the fence, the soil out here is not only wet, it's actually still frozen. So we've got wet soil out here, but just a couple of feet away, we've got my fig trees. Now, right up against the house, protected from the snow and the rain, you can really see this line of demarcation right here. This is where I watered the plants yesterday. This is nice and wet. It's wet down about a finger length. But just right next to it where I didn't water, it's bone dry. The entire area was bone dry all the way out to the edge of the plastic. Now, fig trees in my area are moderately hardy. They will die. If they're not covered, they will die to the ground over the winter. And any of your moderately hardy plants, if they dry out completely over the winter, it'll make them less hardy. So you want to keep the root zones moist. So I drug a hose over here and I trickled water on them for about 3 hours in several different areas so that they would get the moisture that they needed. So that is it. Those are the areas in the plants that I pay attention to in the winter, even when we've had snow on the ground, even when it seems like everything is really wet. There are certain areas of your property, certain plants that really need to be checked on during the winter to make sure they have enough water. And I'd love to know if you've been checking on your plants and if you've had to water over the winter too. So hopefully this video has been helpful to you. If it has been helpful, I hope you like, subscribe, share it with your friends, and go have a wonderful garden adventure.